Justice has been a embedded part of my value system, my perspective, really from the time that I was born and raised in the inner city. Even the neighborhood that I grew up in, my grandma, she's 98 years old now, still very feisty. But when she purchased that home, she couldn't even buy it herself. She had to go through a white lawyer because they wouldn't have sold the home to her as a black woman in 1955. Not only that, but she tells me the story of how when she moved in, within 2 weeks, there were for sale signs up in the entire neighborhood. Now that same house that she still lives in to this day, that I grew up in, is in a rundown neighborhood. And when you understand the economic situation that involves with, those type of migratory patterns, you realize it impacts everybody. It's so interesting because, growing up, there was something that I just thought I would never be, and that was any way associated with Christians or Jesus at all. In fact, I had kind of grown up to believe that was part of the problem. My major in college was Africana Studies and Sociology, and so I did a lot of reading about the history of especially slavery in this country. And one of the things that become clear is that people use the Bible to justify slavery and oppression, what we look at as America's original sin, darkest moment in American history. And you had, Christians who were advocating for those things. And that was stuff that I had heard about, but to actually read and see those stories take place was something that made me just go, okay, I don't want to have anything to do with that. Then a funny thing happened when I got to college. I remember actually reading, as part of my assignment, the autobiography of Frederick Douglass, and seeing that in the appendix, the person who we look at as probably one of the foremost abolitionists, a person who was a former slave, who says that when his slave master got converted to Christianity, he was more brutal and more severe than before. Goes out of his way to explain and to distinguish the fact that what he's talking about and what he refers to as the slave-holding Christianity of America is completely in contrast and different from what he refers to the peaceable Christianity of Christ. So much so, he says that to call this slave-holding religion Christianity is the greatest of libels and slanders, he says. And I started to read that and recognize, wow, like he understood and had a critique and a perspective about this thing called following Jesus that was very different than those who were using it in a negative way. And then I started to discover that that was essentially a major part of the abolitionist movement. When you go to England and William Wilberforce and see, his activism that was very much inspired by his faith, to, William Lloyd Garrison and Harriet Beecher Stowe and Frederick Douglass, and of course, Harriet Tubman, who, herself was called Moses, and they called her Moses because she was leading her people out of slavery. I started reluctantly, going to church and reading a Bible. And what I discovered was that the Jesus that I found in those pages was completely different than the one that I had heard about or saw people represent. That blew me away. Like, even for example, the fact that when you looked at his life, he starts and introduces himself by saying, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor, to, preach freedom to the captive, recovery of sight to the blind, and to proclaim the, favorable year of the Lord. And you look at that and you go, wow, that's his introduction. When I started to read the Beatitudes, right, the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, blessed are they, who are poor, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed, are you hunger and thirst for righteousness, for you will be filled. And I'm like, man, he's talking about this kingdom. He's talking about this vision for society that is much more compelling and deep and fair than something that I ever thought would ever be communicated in a Christian context. I love what he has these warnings to the religious leaders. And that was the other thing that blew me away, was the fact that most of his harshest critiques came to religious people. So he says, woe to you Pharisees, because you tithe over mint and cumin, but you ignore the weightier matters of the law, which is justice and mercy. You should have done that without neglecting the former. And so I began to realize that if I was going to be a follower of Jesus, then that meant that I had to be an advocate of justice. We have to understand that these systems of inequality, whether they relate to poverty, exploitation, and slavery, sexual exploitation and sex trafficking, that these are systemic issues that have to be addressed both in a corporate as well as an individual level. Oftentimes, the focus is so individual, my personal relationship with God, my personal relationship with Jesus, me saying a prayer, that we lose a sense of the fact that God also came to usher in a kingdom. And Jesus is referred to a Messiah and a king who's coming to establish a kingdom that's not of this world. A kingdom that he says, the least among you will be the greatest. A kingdom that he establishes, and on the night before he's crucified, he actually washes the disciples' feet and says, I'm doing this as an example for you to do to each other. And yet there is that individual level too. And this is what hit me. So I was all for, the fight the power and being for the people. But the thing that turned the corner for me spiritually was something on a very basic level, right? And just if I could be real, so I'm, senior in high school and I'm trying to be a player, have two girls at the same time, and I get caught. And this was before I was ever thinking about Jesus at all. And the girl, she said something to me that has stayed with me for the rest of my life. She said, you're no better than other guys. In fact, you're worse because you think you're better than them. And when she said that, it landed on me. And I realized that the problem wasn't just out there. The problem wasn't just with people who I had to protest against, who were taking advantage of other people. The problem was also in here, that when it benefited me, I chose to think what was fair was that which was in my best interest. And that the thing that's amazing about Jesus is he doesn't just stop at the structural, but he also turns to the individual and says that he who sins is a slave to sin. That there's a sense of bondage that we're in when we are caught up in our own vices and seeking our own sense of pleasure. And so what he offers is an exchange that says, instead of you calling the shots, which is inevitably going to lead to you hurting people, even if it's on a micro level or a macro level, follow me. Follow me, and I will reorient your understanding of what is fair and just and true. And it won't be based on your subjective, self-serving interests. It's going to be based on an objective whole interest of everyone. And that's because it's going to be based on my kingdom. And that was the thing that transformed me personally, because I realized I fell short of my own, desire to be this fair, nice, good person when it came down to it in my interpersonal relationships. Even though I didn't have power in the sense that I was wielding it in a way that was exploiting other people, I was wielding it in a way that was exploiting personal relationships. And that was the Jesus that challenged me to a higher height that I could go to myself when I realized I failed in meeting my own expectations, and I didn't have the resources within myself to make that happen on my own.